Imagine the single worst defeat the Japanese army suffered in the entire Second World War. Not in the Pacific, not at sea, not at the hands of the Americans. On land, in a corner of South Asia that almost no one can find on a map, at the far edge of an empire that was already beginning to crack. Now imagine that the battle that broke them, that killed or destroyed more than half of the 85,000 men they committed, was fought at its most savage and most decisive across 11 meters of asphalt. A tennis court, in a garden, behind a colonial administrator's bungalow on a ridge in the Naga Hills. Before I tell you how that happened, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments how many Japanese soldiers you think died in this single campaign. Because when I give you the number, you are not going to believe it. And you are certainly not going to understand why you have never heard of this battle before. Stay until the end. What you are about to discover involves a general who built a Shinto shrine in the jungle while his men starved to death around him, a garrison that ran out of water and kept fighting anyway, and a tennis court where two armies threw grenades at each other across a distance shorter than the average living room. To understand how a tennis court became the pivot of the entire campaign, we have to go back 3 years. In December of 1941, the Japanese Empire set itself on fire in the most spectacular possible way, and discovered, to its own apparent surprise, that the fire spread. The attack on Pearl Harbor pulled the United States into a war that Japan had been fighting in China for 4 years. What followed in the weeks and months after Pearl Harbor was a military achievement so swift and so total that it reshaped the map of the known world in the time it takes a season to change. Malaya fell. Hong Kong fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. The Philippines fell. Entire colonial systems that had taken European powers decades to construct came apart in weeks. Singapore was the centerpiece of that collapse. It was supposed to be the impregnable fortress of the British Empire in Asia, a naval base, a symbol, a guarantee. On the 15th of February, 1942, the garrison of 90,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendered to a Japanese force smaller than the one defending the island. It was the largest surrender in British military history. Churchill called it a disaster. He was understating. Burma followed. From January to May of 1942, British and Indian forces fought a withdrawal through the length of the country, a retreat of approximately 900 miles over 5 months, the longest in British military history. The men who survived it arrived on the Indian frontier exhausted, diseased, and convinced of something that their commanders could not easily argue against. The Japanese were a different kind of soldier. Better at the jungle, better at night. Better at the encirclement tactics that had turned retreat after retreat into near rout. The Japanese, in the minds of the men who had faced them, had become something between an enemy and a force of nature. The army that crawled back into India in the summer of 1942 called itself. With the dark accuracy of men who had earned the right to choose their own name, the Forgotten Army. The war in Europe filled the newspapers. The war in the Pacific occupied the strategic imagination of the Allied High Command. The war in Burma, on the Indian frontier, in the hill stations and jungle valleys of the Northeast. That war received what was left over. Less equipment, less press, less recognition, less of everything except the expectation that it would be fought and won. The man who had led that retreat would need to be remembered. He is the reason any of this ended the way it did. But before he can be understood, we need to spend time with a different man, one whose ambition, arrogance, and catastrophic self-belief set the whole catastrophe in motion. His name was General Mutaguchi. He was born on the 7th of October, 1888, in Saga Prefecture. The second son of a minor official, adopted as a child into the Mutaguchi family. He graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1910 and from the Army Staff College in 1917. He served in the Siberian intervention, went to France as a military attaché, and rose steadily through the apparatus of the Imperial Japanese Army, an institution that promoted by faction and connection as much as by competence, and in which Mutaguchi, well-connected and politically astute, thrived. He is not famous. He should be infamous. On the 7th of July, 1937, units under his command at the Marco Polo Bridge near Peking fired the shots that escalated a minor local skirmish into the full-scale Second Sino-Japanese War. Whether this was an accident of temperament or deliberate provocation remains debated. What is not debated is what Mutaguchi believed about it. He believed that weakness invited attack. He believed in escalation as policy. He had already triggered the war that would consume millions of lives, and this fact did not appear to trouble him. It appeared instead to oblige him. He said so later in words that deserve to be kept. He had started the Marco Polo incident, which had broadened into the China incident, which had expanded into the Great East Asia War. If he pushed into India now, by his own efforts, and exercised a decisive influence on the outcome of that war, he would have justified himself in the eyes of his nation. He was not trying to win a campaign. He was trying to pay a debt to history. That is a dangerous thing in a general. By February of 1942, Mutaguchi commanded the 18th Division in the assault on Singapore, a central role in the attack, and a wound sustained during the fighting whose precise circumstances were more complicated than the official record suggested. The version involving a grenade fragment sustained while fleeing bombardment toward a sewer was not the version he preferred. He recovered. Singapore fell. He claimed his share of the victory. His division transferred to Burma in April of 1942. In March of 1943, he was given command of the Japanese 15th Army, the formation responsible for the Central Front facing Imphal and Assam. From the moment he took command, he pushed a single idea with the relentlessness of a man who has confused personal redemption with military strategy. He wanted to invade India. The plan had opponents at every level. Staff officers at Burma Area Army Headquarters objected. The Southern Expeditionary Army staff raised tactical and logistical problems. Mutaguchi fired his own intelligence chief for suggesting the operation was impossible. He made an emotional appeal to his superior, General Kawabe. The Akaroam, two men had both been present at the Marco Polo incident, and Mutaguchi invoked that shared history as a bond and an obligation. The plan moved upward through the command structure. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo gave final approval after questioning a staff officer about it from his bath. The offensive was codenamed U-Go. 3 divisions would cross the Chindwin River into northeast India, aimed at the British supply base at Imphal and the ridge town of Kohima, 60 miles to the north. If Imphal fell, the road to India opened. If Kohima fell and the Japanese pushed on to the railhead at Dimapur, the supply lines connecting the entire British Eastern Front would be severed. Subhas Chandra Bose, who commanded the Indian National Army and had spent 2 years persuading the Japanese that India would rise against the British the moment Japanese boots touched Indian soil, was enthusiastic. His dream and Mutaguchi's ambition had found each other. Mutaguchi's logistical arrangements for the campaign were also his most revealing act. His men would carry sufficient food for 3 weeks. Once they captured the British supply dumps at Imphal, which he was confident would happen quickly because he was confident the British would collapse and run as they always had. They would feed themselves on captured stores. As a supplementary measure, each division would drive a herd of cattle through the jungle to serve as a living food supply. This arrangement was known privately among junior officers as the Genghis Khan strategy. The cattle did not survive the jungle in the numbers required. The men who depended on them would discover this at the worst possible time. On the 7th of January, 1944, Imperial General Headquarters approved the operation. 85,000 men would cross the Chindwin in March. What was waiting for them on the other side was, in large part, the work of the man Mutaguchi had never bothered to understand. William Slim was born on the 6th of August, 1891, in Bishopston, a village on the edge of Bristol. His father was a hardware merchant. There was no family military tradition, no connections, no obvious path to command. He obtained a commission in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment in August of 1914, fought at Gallipoli and was wounded, fought in Mesopotamia and won a military cross, and stayed in the army after the war, because civilian life held nothing that interested him in the same way. His interwar career was slow and unremarkable. He taught at Staff College, Camberley, commanded a battalion of Gurkha rifles, and learned the Indian Army from the inside in the way that only 20 years of service makes possible. His soldiers called him Uncle Bill, not as a term of affection exactly, though there was affection in it, but as a statement of fact. He was present with his men in a way that senior commanders were not always present. He visited every unit he could reach. He spoke plainly. He had no taste for the theatrical self-presentation that marked some of his contemporaries, and none at all for the cultivated distance between general and soldier that British military tradition sometimes offered as a mark of authority. He wanted, he said once, to keep friends in the army after the war, and thought it unnecessary to shout the odds about the 14th. His soldiers responded to the absence of performance with something they had not had much occasion to feel in 2 years: confidence. What he found when he took command of the 14th Army in October of 1943 was a formation that feared the Japanese as jungle fighters, that had absorbed the lesson of defeat as a permanent truth about relative capabilities. His first task was to dismantle that belief. He did it through training, through doctrine, and through one foundational tactical innovation. When the Japanese encircled a British or Indian unit, as they invariably did, because encirclement was the core of their jungle tactics, the unit would no longer retreat. It would hold. It would be supplied by air. And the Japanese, who had planned on the British running and abandoning their stores, would starve against the walls of a position they could not break. He proved the concept in February of 1944 at a place called the Admin Box in the Arakan, the first time a British-led force had held a Japanese encirclement until relief arrived. The lesson was absorbed across every formation in the 14th Army. The soldiers who would face Yugo in March had been, in the 18 months since the retreat, remade. Slim knew the offensive was coming. He knew the general shape of Mutaguchi's plan. He made a decision that his superiors found alarming and that subsequent events entirely vindicated. He would not defend the frontier. He would let Mutaguchi's 3 divisions cross the Chindwin and overextend their supply lines across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, and he would fight them at Imphal on a plain he had spent 6 months filling with supplies. Whoever designed Burma, he observed, designed it for the Japanese. That being so, the design had to be turned against its intended beneficiary. There was one place, however, where the trap had a gap. 60 miles north of Imphal, on a steep ridge in the Naga Hills, a road climbed through a pass to a small administrative town called Kohima. That road was the only supply line between the base at Dimapur in the Brahmaputra Valley and the British Corps at Imphal. If the Japanese took Kohima, they cut the road. If they cut the road, Imphal could not be resupplied, and the whole design collapsed. Slim expected the Japanese to send a detachment, a few battalions, to contain Kohima, while the main effort struck Imphal. He underestimated how many men Mutaguchi would send. Kohima, in the spring of 1944, was the administrative capital of Nagaland. Its deputy commissioner was a man named Charles Pawsey. He had been in post since 1935, a veteran of the Somme who had won the Military Cross twice, and in 9 years he had built something rarer than most colonial administrators achieved: genuine mutual regard with the people he governed. The Naga people liked Pawsey in the specific way that people like those who treat them as worthy of respect. When the war arrived at his door, they would not forget it. His bungalow stood on the hillside at a sharp bend in the road, on a terrace above the junction, with gardens on several levels and a summer house at the top. On one of the lower terraces, laid out with the unhurried confidence of colonial administration, was a tennis court. Asphalt, regulation size, 12 meters across. In peacetime, the social center of British Nagaland, the place where the small community of administrators and officers gathered in the thin mountain air, where the view across the valleys and forested ridges was, by all accounts, remarkable. The ridge itself ran roughly north to south, approximately a mile long and 400 yards wide, with a series of terraced hills and gullies running parallel to the road. Garrison Hill at the north end, Jail Hill, Field Supply Depot Hill, Detail Issue Hill, Kuki Pike toward the south. The road from Dimapur ran along the eastern face, climbing to the northern end before turning south toward Imphal. Whoever held the ridge controlled the road. Whoever controlled the road controlled the battle. The garrison defending all of this, in March of 1944, consisted of approximately 1,500 combat-capable men. The newly raised and largely inexperienced 1st Battalion of the Assam Regiment, some companies of the paramilitary Assam Rifles, and an assortment of rear echelon troops, convalescents, clerks, and base personnel who had not expected to find themselves in a fight. The ridge had not been properly prepared for defense. There were no good gun positions. The bunkers that existed had been badly sited. Nobody had seriously expected that the Japanese would come here in force. The Naga villagers on the hill above the ridge were watching all of this with the attention of people who understood, better than any military planner, what the geography meant. They had already decided, without being asked, whose side they were on. This was not loyalty to empire. It was territory. The Japanese were strangers who would take what they needed and move on. Pawsey was a man they knew, and the land was theirs. On the 15th of March, 1944, Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato ordered his men across the Chindwin River and into the hills. Sato was born in 1893 in Yamagata Prefecture, a career officer of the Imperial Japanese Army, a graduate of the Military Academy in 1913 and the Army Staff College in 1921. He and Mutaguchi had been on opposite sides of the most vicious factional dispute in the pre-war Japanese Army, the split between rival political factions in the early 1930s, and the personal enmity between them went back at least a decade. Sato considered Mutaguchi a blockhead. This was not a minority view among the senior officers of the 15th Army, but Sato held it with a particular precision. He had not been involved in the planning of U-Go. He had grave misgivings about its chances. Before the operation launched, he told his staff that they might all starve to death. He was not wrong, and he knew he was not wrong. He crossed the Chindwin anyway, because the Imperial Japanese Army did not offer its divisional commanders the option of refusing a direct order. And because the alternatives available to a Japanese general who questioned the institution publicly were not alternatives at all. His division, the 31st Infantry, crossed the Chindwin on a front almost 60 miles wide. 15,000 men, 3 regiments and a mountain artillery regiment from which half the guns had been left behind because there was insufficient transport to carry them through the jungle. The food that remained after the cattle began dying was not enough for the operation Mutaguchi had designed. Sato had done the arithmetic before he started walking. They made good progress. The terrain was appalling. Ridges and valleys covered in dense forest, trails barely wide enough for a mule, rivers in various states of seasonal fury. But the 31st Division moved with the disciplined speed that had been one of the genuine achievements of the Japanese Army in the early stages of the war. By the 20th of March, the left wing of the division, under Major General Miyazaki, had reached and engaged Indian troops at a village called Sangshak, 60 miles northeast of Imphal. Those troops were the 50th Indian Parachute Brigade under Brigadier Maxwell Hope Thompson, and they had not been sent there to die. They had been sent to delay. They delayed for 4 days at a cost of 600 men. And in those 4 days, they achieved something whose importance would only become clear later. On the 23rd of March, the defenders of Sangshak found the body of a Japanese officer on the battlefield. On his person, they found the complete operational plans for Yugo, the 3-division assault, the objective of Imphal, and the route of the 31st Division toward Kohima. A brigade runner slipped through the Japanese lines that night with the document. The information reached the British chain of command in time to begin preparing Kohima's defense. Not in time to do the job properly, but in time to begin. Sangshak also cost the Japanese 500 casualties and 5 days they had not budgeted. Those days were not recovered. They became part of the margin by which the battle was eventually decided. The 31st Division reached the Kohima area in early April. On the 29th of March, the Japanese had already cut the Imphal-Kohima road to the south. On the 4th of April, the 4th Battalion of the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment arrived at Kohima from the west, the last reinforcements to get through before the road closed behind them. They were 446 men. By nightfall, on the 5th of April, the Japanese had sealed every approach. The garrison was surrounded. The Royal West Kents, known in the regiment's older traditions as the Dirty Half-Hundred, from the soot-blackened facings of their 18th-century uniforms, had been sent to Kohima once already, then recalled while higher headquarters argued about priorities, and then sent again when the scale of the Japanese advance became undeniable. The fury of soldiers who have been shuffled like playing cards in a hand they are being asked to win is a specific kind of fury, and the West Kents carried it with them up the road to a garrison they had not trained with, defending positions they had not chosen. Their battalion commander was Lieutenant Colonel John Laverty. He understood the situation immediately and said so plainly. Unless they were rescued soon, it would be too late. The garrison that the West Kents had arrived to reinforce was commanded by Colonel Hugh Richards, formerly of the Chindits, who had taken charge on the 22nd of March and found himself responsible for a position that was simultaneously underdefended, undersupplied, and suddenly the most strategically critical point in the entire Northeast India theater. He had been given command of a scratch force, the Assam Regiment Survivors, the Assam Rifles, a battalion of the Royal Nepalese Army called the Sher Regiment, various detachments of Indian infantry, and a considerable number of men who were not infantry at all. He had been given neither the time nor the resources to prepare the ridge properly. He did what he could. The question of whether he was adequately credited for it is the kind of question that attached itself to Kohima like mud. In the first days of the siege, the Japanese attacked with the energy of men who understood they needed to move fast before their supplies ran out. The perimeter was pushed back, position by position. Jail Hill fell. Detail Issue Hill fell. Field Supply Depot Hill fell. The garrison was compressed toward the northern end of the ridge, toward Garrison Hill, and toward the DC's bungalow and the tennis court on the terrace below it. Water ran out almost immediately. There were no water sources within the defensive perimeter. Storage tanks existed, but storage tanks can be destroyed by shell fire, and Japanese shell fire was constant. Within days of the siege beginning, the daily water ration for the defending soldiers was half a mug. In April heat, at altitude, under physical stress, under continuous artillery fire, half a mug per man per day. Aerial resupply was attempted. On the 13th of April, 3 American C-47s flew low over the ridge and parachuted ammunition, water, and medical supplies into the defense. Almost all of it drifted into Japanese lines. The Japanese used the captured mortar ammunition to shell the garrison with its own materiel. That same morning, the Japanese deliberately targeted the Indian General Hospital spur, killing 3 doctors and wounding more than 50 men who were already wounded. There is a particular quality of desperation in the act of shelling those treating the injured. And the men of the garrison understood what it meant about the Japanese assessment of how close the end was. Lance Corporal John Pennington Harmon was a 29-year-old soldier of the 4th Royal West Kents, the son of a wealthy family whose father owned Lundy Island off the Devon coast. He had no obligation to be here, except the one he had chosen. On the 7th and 8th of April, during the heaviest fighting around Detail Hill, Harmon left his position twice, alone, and attacked Japanese machine gun posts single-handedly. The first time, he destroyed the post and walked back to his lines upright and at a normal pace, as if the distance between him and safety were a public street on an ordinary morning. The second time, he destroyed the post, turned to walk back, and was shot. He died before he could be evacuated. He was awarded the Victoria Cross. He is buried in the Kohima War Cemetery, and it is important to say that plainly now, because we will return to where he is buried. The fight for the tennis court began on the 8th of April, when the Japanese launched their first attacks into the northeastern section of the defense, the area of the DC's bungalow. By the 9th, the British and Indian troops defending the building had been driven out of it and forced back to the far side of the tennis court. What remained between the two sides was 11 meters of asphalt. The court sat on a 12-foot embankment above the road. This detail, which sounds architectural and minor, was decisive for weeks. Tanks could not reach it. Grenades thrown from below fell short or hit the bank. Flame weapons could not reach it. Mortars at that range were as likely to find friendly positions as Japanese ones. A British diary entry from inside the garrison captured the tactical geometry precisely. The Japanese had got dug in under the concrete base of the tennis court, which was peculiarly situated on the top of a 12-foot bank so that tanks could not get at it. Grenades and flame weapons could not reach it, and the troops were too close together for heavier guns to engage. What could bridge those 11 meters was a grenade thrown by hand, a rifle aimed at a distance that in a civilian street would be a neighborly conversation, and the accumulated will of men on both sides who understood that the ground they were standing on was the hinge of everything. Sergeant Major Haynes, blinded in the fighting, refused evacuation and stayed with his unit to steady the men who still had their sight. One soldier of the West, Kent's, rendered unconscious by a blast, woke to find a Japanese officer in the trench with him. He waited for the right moment, killed the officer with his bare hands, and returned to his Bren gun. Another, his weapon jammed at the worst possible moment, killed his attacker with a shovel. These are the acts that war produces when it has compressed itself to 11 meters and run out of abstraction. On the 13th of April, the Japanese launched what they intended as the decisive assault on the tennis court area. Heavy artillery and mortar fire fell on the bungalow and the court throughout the morning. Multiple infantry assaults followed and were repelled in what the British Ministry of Defense later described, in the measured language of official documents that had seen many battles, as some of the hardest, closest, and grimmest fighting of the war, with grenades hurled across the tennis court at point-blank range. A Southeast Asia Command public relations officer present at a later stage of the fighting found the phrase he needed. A grenade match was played across the bungalow's tennis courts. He was right that it was the right phrase. He was wrong that it was a game. Colonel Richards, watching from Garrison Hill through the smoke and the blasted stumps of what had been a wooded ridge, drew what comfort he could from the regimental flag of the Royal West Kents still flying above him. The White Horse of Kent. The motto Invicta, undefeated. He noted later that this was not merely a symbol, it was information. The flag meant the hill had not fallen. During those days, a patrol from the Rajput Regiment penetrated the Japanese siege lines and reached Kohima Ridge. The patrol commander found Colonel Laverty and asked him the question that the relief force most needed answered. Laverty's reply was precise. Morale was high, but he did not think the garrison could hold for more than another 48 hours. The patrol returned and reported what it had found, emphasizing the high morale more than the urgency of the timeline. Relief was delayed another day as a consequence. This is not a criticism. It is the record of how close it came. On the night of the 17th of April, it came as close as it ever did. The Japanese launched their largest assault of the siege. They took the DC's bungalow. They took Kuki Piquet. The garrison was cut in two. Garrison Hill, the last defensible ground, where the wounded lay and where the regimental flag still flew, was exposed on three sides. The tennis court was within reach. The end was apparent to everyone on both sides who was still capable of counting the distances between things. The Japanese did not attack Garrison Hill that night. They had taken the bungalow and Kuki Piquet. They had split the garrison. They had driven the defenders to their last 350 square meters, an area smaller than many suburban gardens. And then they stopped. They were exhausted. They were hungry. They had been fighting for 12 days without a proper supply line in April heat at altitude. And they had reached the point where the body will not answer courage's demands, regardless of what courage requires. If there had been 20 fresh reserves available on the evening of the 17th, if the British artillery positioned at Jotsoma had been knocked out in the preceding days, the arithmetic of that night, run to its logical conclusion, does not end with the liberation of Imphal. At dawn on the 18th of April, British artillery opened from the west. Through the smoke and the morning haze, through the blasted landscape of what had been Kohima Ridge, the soldiers on Garrison Hill made out the turbans of the 1st Punjab Regiment coming through toward PK Hill. The 2nd British Division had broken the Japanese roadblocks. The siege was over. The battle was not. The relief on the 18th of April did not move the Japanese from the tennis court. Sato's 31st Division was not prepared to yield what it had taken simply because British reinforcements had arrived. The Japanese held Jail Hill, Field Supply Depot Hill, GPT Ridge, Kuki Piquet, and Naga Village. They would hold most of these for another 4 weeks. Successive commanders of the British 4th Brigade were killed in the fighting on GPT Ridge. In places, the attacking troops cut steps into mud-covered slopes and built handrails in order to make progress toward Japanese positions, firing down on them from above. The tennis court and the DC's bungalow were the last positions on the ridge to fall. Every attempt to outflank them failed. Every direct assault failed. The 12-foot embankment was still there, still preventing armored access, still limiting what could be brought to bear. The solution, when it came, was characteristically unglamorous. A bulldozer was brought up and a track scraped across the hillside above the position, barely wide enough for one vehicle, built in the middle of a battle under fire by men operating heavy machinery while being shot at. Up that track, on the 13th of May, 1944, Sergeant Waterhouse of the 149th Regiment Royal Armored Corps drove a Grant tank. He fired his 75mm gun into Japanese bunkers at a range of 20 yards. 2 platoons of the 2nd Battalion Dorset Regiment followed the tank up the track. The DC's bungalow fell. The tennis court was British again. By morning, on the 13th of May, every position on Kohima Ridge had been recaptured. Throughout the entire engagement, from the 4th of April to that day, not a single Japanese soldier had reached the western side of the court alive. At 15th Army Headquarters, General Mutaguchi was conducting a different kind of war. He had not arrived at the front until the 29th of April, 6 weeks after the offensive began. 6 weeks during which his 3 divisions had crossed the Chindwin, besieged Kohima, surrounded Imphal, and discovered that the British were not going to run. When he finally moved toward the front, he lingered at Schwebo long enough for his staff to establish a comfort station. The men of the 31st Division had been on insufficient rations for considerably longer than their original 3-week allocation by that point. At Imphal, the divisions attacking from multiple directions had spent April and early May in a series of assaults that failed with increasing regularity. On the 13th of April, a Japanese regiment seized Nungshigam Ridge, overlooking the main Imphal airstrip, a direct threat to the air supply sustaining the British Corps there. The counterattack came the same day. The 5th Indian Division, with M3 Lee tanks, whose appearance on gradients the Japanese had declared impassable for armor. Every officer of the attacking Indian Infantry, the 1st Battalion of the 17th Dogra Regiment, was killed or wounded in the assault. The ridge was retaken anyway. By the 1st of May, all Japanese attacks at Imphal had stalled. Mutaguchi's plan had failed. Nobody had formally told Mutaguchi. His response was to dismiss his divisional commanders. He sacked the commander of the 15th Division. He sacked the commander of the 33rd Division. He filed orders for continued offensive action directed at formations no longer capable of advancing. He directed reserves that did not exist to positions that no longer mattered. As the army he had designed collapsed around him, he ordered an area of jungle cleared near his headquarters and erected within it a Shinto shrine, a patch of white sand, 4 bamboo poles decorated and placed at the 4 compass points, a monument to the victory that was not coming. He was building a memorial to his own ambition in the middle of a disaster. The dead could wait. In the 31st Division sector, Sato's men had been fighting since early April without resupply of any consequence. The key cattle were dead. The tracks east of Kohima that were supposed to bring food forward had been cut by the British 23rd Long-Range Penetration Brigade. Villages that might have provided sustenance had been stripped. The men were eating leaves and grass and whatever could be found in abandoned positions. By mid-May, they were dying of starvation and of cholera, malaria, and dysentery that filled the vacuum left by hunger. On the 25th of May, Sato sent a signal to 15th Army Headquarters. His division would withdraw on the 1st of June unless supplied. Mutaguchi's response, which included an order to detach elements of the starving 31st Division to attack Imphal from the north, was confused and contradictory. Sato had predicted, before the operation began, that they would all starve to death. He had been right. He had been ignored. He was not prepared to be ignored anymore. On the 31st of May, Kotoku Sato ordered the 31st Division to withdraw, without orders, without permission, against explicit instructions from Mutaguchi to hold every position. He transmitted his reasons in plain language so that anyone in range could hear. His men had fought for 80 days and received nothing. For a divisional commander to retreat without authorization in the Imperial Japanese Army was an act without precedent. That it was also, given the state of his division, the only rational act available, did not matter to the institution. Mutaguchi could not court-martial him. A court-martial would require an examination of the circumstances that had brought the 31st Division to that condition, and an examination of those circumstances would require scrutiny of Mutaguchi's planning, his timeline, his food allocation for a campaign that lasted 5 months on what had been designed as 3 weeks of rations. Mutaguchi summoned a military doctor instead. The doctor examined Sato and produced the diagnosis that had been requested. Mental breakdown, unfit to stand trial. Sato was relieved of command, transferred to the Philippines as punishment for disobeying the order that would have killed what remained of his division, and denied the court-martial he demanded for the rest of his life. He died in 1959, the record unchanged. Having spent 15 years unable to clear his name of a charge that existed only to prevent the truth from being heard in public. Among the Indian National Army soldiers who had crossed the Chindwin alongside the Japanese, believing in Bose's promised liberation, the retreat produced its own reckoning. As the campaign collapsed, Indian National Army men defected back toward British lines, not as traitors, but as starving men who had been offered a nation and received a jungle. Some surrendered. Some died with the Japanese formations they had joined. The liberation that was supposed to sweep India had consumed its own believers, along with everyone else. The retreat from Kohima and Imphal, the route the Japanese survivors called the White Bone Road, was not a military withdrawal. The soldiers of the 15th Army fell back toward the Chindwin in the condition of men who have given everything they had and been asked for more. Those too badly wounded to walk were left by the trail. The town of Tamu, recovered by the Allies at the end of July, contained 550 unburied Japanese corpses and more than 100 severely wounded men, dying slowly among them. The numbers that close this chapter require saying plainly, because they are the point. Of the 85,000 men who crossed the Chindwin in March of 1944, 53,000 were dead or missing by the time the operation ended. Most had not died in battle. They had starved. They had contracted the diseases that follow malnutrition into jungle terrain. They had died of exhaustion on trails that offered no help and no mercy. The 12,000 pack animals were dead. The 30,000 cattle were dead. The artillery had been abandoned. On the 3rd of July, 1944, Mutaguchi ordered the offensive broken off. He was relieved of his own command on the 30th of August, retired in December, convicted of war crimes in Singapore after the war, and released in 1948 when the specific charges could not be sustained to the required legal threshold. He died in Tokyo on the 2nd of August, 1966. His grave is in a cemetery called Tama Ryan. It does not appear on the cemetery's guide maps. The Allied victory came at a price that the scale of the Japanese losses can obscure if you allow it to. 16,500 British and Indian soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing across the combined Kohima and Imphal battles. At Kohima specifically, 4,064 casualties. Of the 446 West Kents who arrived on the 5th of April, only 168 avoided becoming casualties. 3 Victoria Crosses were awarded for actions at Kohima. Lance Corporal John Pennington Harmon, who died on Detail Hill. Captain John Neil Randall of the 2nd Royal Norfolk Regiment. Jemadar Abdul Hafiz of the 9th Jat Regiment, who was 18 years old when he earned the youngest Victoria Cross recipient from the British Indian Army. His name belongs here. It appears less often than it should. On the 22nd of June, 1944, at milestone 109 on the Kohima-Imphal Road, soldiers of the 5th Indian Division coming south from Kohima met soldiers of the 2nd British Division coming north from Imphal. They shook hands on a road that had been cut for 88 days. The siege of Imphal was over. Slim drove south through the monsoon, an offensive his superiors had considered impossible, sustained entirely by air supply. Mandalay fell in March of 1945. Meiktila fell the same month. Rangoon fell in May. The Burma campaign was effectively over. The supply route to China had been preserved. The American strategy in the Pacific, which depended on China remaining in the war, had been sustained at Kohima and Imphal by soldiers most of the world had never heard of, and most of Britain would not remember. In December of 1944, the Viceroy of India, Lord Wavell, knighted William Slim, Geoffrey Scoons, Montague Stopford, and Philip Christison at a ceremony at Imphal, in front of Scottish, Gurkha, and Punjabi regiments. The photograph of that ceremony is one of the most consequential images from the Second World War's Asian theater, and one of the least reproduced. In 2013, the British National Army Museum conducted a public vote to determine Britain's greatest battle. D-Day was on the list. Waterloo was on the list. Trafalgar was on the list. The result was Kohima and Imphal, voted first. The vote was an act of belated recognition. It was also a statement about what history chooses to preserve and what it allows to dissolve. Before this becomes simply the story of a great victory, something must be said plainly about who it was won by and what was done with their story afterward. The 14th Army that earned that recognition was not a British army in the way the phrase is usually understood. It was Indian, Gurkha, African, and Nepalese, with a British component that shrank as the campaign extended. The Indian Army that underpinned the whole enterprise numbered 2.3 million men by 1945, the largest voluntary force in the history of organized warfare. These men bore the weight of this campaign in ways that post-war commemoration repeatedly failed to name clearly, divided between a Britain focused on Europe and an India ambivalent about its colonial military service. Robert Lyman, who has written as carefully as anyone about this battle, stated it plainly. The Japanese regard Imphal as their greatest defeat ever, and it gave Indian soldiers a belief in their own martial ability that showed they could fight as well or better than anyone else. That belief did not dissolve after the war. It went somewhere. The Naga people, on whose land all of this was fought, are a different kind of omission. They guided British patrols through terrain impenetrable to outsiders. They carried wounded soldiers on stretchers across mountain trails. They provided intelligence and shelter and the particular assistance of those defending their own ground against strangers. When independence came in 1947 and India incorporated Nagaland, the Naga people, whose political consciousness had been altered permanently by what 2 modern armies had done to their land and their lives in 1944, began the process that would become the Naga independence movement, lasting decades, producing insurgency and negotiation and political complexity that has not been fully resolved to this day. Kohima catalyzed Naga nationalism. The official histories of the battle did not think this worth mentioning. Then there is Sato. He spent 15 years demanding a court-martial that was never granted, unable to clear his name of a charge that had been manufactured to prevent the truth from being examined in a courtroom. The Japanese military establishment declared him mentally unfit because he had refused to let his men die for a plan he had correctly identified before the operation began as a catastrophe. He was right about the supplies. He was right about the timeline. He disobeyed, saved what could be saved, and was punished for the saving. Japanese historians have largely vindicated him in the decades since. The institution that destroyed his reputation never acknowledged what it had done. The Kohima War Cemetery stands on the slopes of Garrison Hill, maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. 1,420 graves, on ground that was once a tennis court. The graves are where the trenches were. The lawn is where the asphalt was. The memorial of the 2nd British Division carries the words that have become the most widely known epitaph to emerge from this war. When you go home, tell them of us and say, "For your tomorrow, we gave our today." John Maxwell Edmonds wrote them. He drew them from the epitaph Simonides composed for the Spartans at Thermopylae. They stand in stone on a ridge in Nagaland, within sight of the valley where the Japanese came out of the jungle in April of 1944 and broke against a garrison that had half a mug of water a day and chose not to run. Among the 1,420 graves is one belonging to Lance Corporal John Pennington Harmon. He destroyed 2 machine gun posts in one day, alone, and walked back upright after the first one, as if the ground between him and safety were a public street, and did not walk back after the second. He is 29 years old in the record, and 29 years old in the stone. He is buried on a tennis court in Nagaland, and the world that sent him there has largely forgotten to look. The Forgotten Army named themselves that in the bitterness of men who had been asked to fight a war that the people they were fighting for declined to watch. The vote in 2013 was the country saying, 70 years later, that it had been watching after all, or that it was prepared to begin. This is not the same as having been there. This is not the same as having counted them when it mattered. But it is a beginning, and a beginning is what you make of it. The tennis court in the Kohima War Cemetery has been remarked in the grass. You can walk its width, 11 meters, the width of no man's land for 37 days, while 2 armies threw everything they had across it and neither one broke. Now you know what happened on that court. Tell someone who doesn't.